it may well be that, a decade from now, looking back on it, this was a positive inflection point in terms of transforming our education system and making a distinction between those aspects of education that are best facilitated interpersonally, dialogically with other humans, and those parts of education which are best facilitated informationally, technologically. I think the most important thing is for children to be confident and trusting in their self-extending ability to learn whatever it is that they're interested in learning or they must learn in order to be happy and survive. And in order to have a conversation about education and the mission of education, you have to have a conversation about learning, right? You have to talk further about what learning is, because most of the time people think of learning as an ancillary mental utility. It's one of the things we do, like we go to the bathroom and we eat and we go for drives and we talk with our friends and we learn. It's like one of the things we do, rather than it's the central dynamic in everything we do. So when we talk about education, I'm talking about, and we talk about healthy learning, I mean that deep participation in extending oneself, one's presence, one's being into the various dimensions of life. So learning is involved in, diet and exercise, and in self-emotional regulation, as it is in dialogue and social relation, as it is in the purely academic or vocational dimensions, right? Education is still thought of in pretty primitive terms, in terms of knowledge and skill acquisition, rather than in, the development of healthy human beings and their readiness to participate in society and in the world as it's unfolding. So I would say education still in the Stone Ages here. And so the mission of education to me is, how do we take this kind of natural, innate, healthy learning orientation that humans come into the world with, and equip them with the things that it takes to be successful in our complex artificial world without losing that. This really precarious, dangerous little space between being a response environment that can respond to whatever they need, whenever they need it, so as to support their participation at all times, as opposed to pedagogically conducting them, as also opposed to or distinct from trying to anticipate what they need and provide it before they're even aware of it, which is fraught with danger, I think, that latter part, right? My experience of school was, I kind of went through it. I guess the most important relevant point to all of this and to my work would be that I probably spent the majority of my entire, kindergarten, 12th grade corridor experience anyway, doing everything I could to be invisible. Right? I think I got up in the front of the class once in 12 years. Well, when you think about teacher or you think about instructor, you have somebody who's kind of like above and outside and, has an agenda with respect to the content. You think of a steward, you think of somebody who has subordinated themselves to the service of another, right? That's kind of where the meaning of that is. And so I think that whether you're a parent or whether you're an educator, that if you're really trying to take care of how healthily a learner is participating, then the better phrase is steward. You're a steward of the health of their learning. And that's kind of my core thing, is that's what we need to become as a people, as the adults of our species need to become stewards of the health of our children's learning. There's a great opportunity for first-person learning. First of all, there's no substitute for first-person learning, right? Whatever it is, whether you're talking about being a parent, you're talking about being an educator, you're either deferring to some other expert outside, or you're informed by your own first-person learning. So with respect to being a teacher or a steward who can really differentiate into dancing on the edge with and stewarding the healthy participation of a learner, there's no substitute for your own first-person learning. So what inside of first-person learning? I would suggest that the most important thing for teachers and parents to do is to start recognizing and paying attention to the way they learn. that the more familiar they are with their own learning process. And there's some exercises that I suggest and could recommend, and I don't know if we have time for that to go into, that would help somebody become more aware of shame and how shame affects their learning. The more first person real that is for you, the more that it's going to inform how you see what's going on with the children you're working with, right? The more that it's an abstraction, the less it's going to be available for you as part of the lens through which you experience them. So a good part of this is not racing off into structured systems of behavior for educators and schools, but rather a first person kind of boot camps to become better first person learners who are aware of certain core dynamics about learning, that because you've become aware of them, you are now in a position to facilitate them better. Survey after survey has shown that the number one fear of adults, other than dying or somebody they love dying or being horribly sick or whatever, is public speaking, right? I think there's a direct connection between that fear and the things that kids experience in classrooms, where they're put right up on the, on the stage, so to speak, of having the attention of the class while they're supposed to be exhibiting this thing they're not yet masterful with, this artificial challenge they're feeling bad about. That's a huge hit. So building the capacity, when that's our concern, then our primary concern is before we race off into what to teach, how to teach, what we think they need, or any of those things, I think we need to develop a kind of base level, which is all about response. It's all about, if you think about what makes somebody a healthy participant in their own learning, it's that they're able to differentiate their own learning needs, their own meaning needs as they're experiencing them, and act on them. They need to be exposed to things to know what they like and what they don't like. They need to have certain frameworks, certain scaffolds that will allow them to develop certain skills that they wouldn't choose to develop, right? That they may not want to develop. So I'm not saying that it should be a free-for-all all the time. I'm just saying that one level of the system and the ground level of the system should be organized about being responsive, and then subsequent levels should deal with exposure and conductance. Where all this leads, in a way, is how do we help children learn into their shame? The compass of shame was a metaphor and a model developed by one of Tompkins' students by the name of Donald Nathanson, who I interviewed extensively in the Children of the Code project. And he basically said there's a series of common strategies that people have when it comes to shame. Some people attack whatever is causing them to feel shame, whether it's themselves or it's somebody else. Other people will withdraw, they'll pull back to protect themselves from the shame, right? There's 4 different poles and details that we could go into that. There's a video on my site about it. Bottom line though is that when most people feel shame, they want to avoid the shame. And the conclusion that I came to, where it connects back to our primary conversation, is that the question I started to ask, what happens when children associate confusion with shame, which is what's happening with math, writing, and reading, right? The 3 big artificial learning challenges. They all bring about this confusion because it's not natural, because it requires this kind of artificial processing that's not in them to do. And it's precariously dependent on how well they're conducted through those artificial challenges. And if for reasons having to do with their lack of readiness to take on the challenge, their educational or instructional guidance through the challenge, they get into a period where they're in protracted difficulty and they begin to blame themselves, then the shame level will get toxic. And when the shame level gets toxic, they want to get away from it. And they will now become emotionally motivated to avoid learning. The kind of political, social discourse and warfare and toxicity that pervades this country right now is a symptom of the kind of learning aversion that our population has. right? We're not learning oriented. We're all born learning oriented, but we learn to want to avoid learning because it makes us feel less good about ourselves. It makes us feel ashamed of ourselves. It makes us feel not as good as somebody else, etc. So I think from our presidential politics to the school boards, shame is running the show in a big way. And that this is one component of it. There's other components of what I call unhealthy learning. But I think the number one thing is that children are learning to feel shame in relation to learning. And when they do, and that becomes frequent enough due to self-blame triggered shame, right? Then their emotional intelligence doesn't want to do that, starts to come up with strategies to avoid that. So the more that their emotional intelligence is trying to avoid learning, that's learning disabling. That's just as learning disabling as some innate neurobiologically ordained or structural issue. It's just that it's an acquired one. It's an acquired learning disability. We don't have any idea what it is that these kids are really going to need to be successful, happy, healthy human beings 20 years from now. And that in that sense, I think you and I meet that I think that we ought to be very careful about what we insist on them learning. I want to be creating environments that vivify their ability to differentiate their own self-sensing on the edge of their learning, right? And that's a dynamic, energetic thing more than it's an abstract content thing. So if you can turn philosophy into a, like I would with history needs to be the story of me, the story of us, not some abstract thing that happened, but I need to be connected to it in a different way, right? So to the extent that you're able to use philosophy as a scaffolding for self-inquiry, not inquiry in the abstract, but self-realization, so like this is how I am, how that connects up to what I feel, what I think, how I think, then yeah, the advantages to waiting later is there's greater cognitive linguistic readiness at the point of entry into the challenge of reading. The disadvantage to waiting later is there's more self-consciousness, and therefore exactly the opposite of what was just proposed. There's actually a greater chance of more shame if there was greater difficulty. So earlier means less self-consciousness, less prone to shame, but less readiness for the confusion that's in the challenge. So it's a really precarious balance. Tangent migrations, for example. Tangent migrations is one of my favorite things. By that I mean everybody who's listening has experienced the situation in which they're paying attention to something. It's something that's important, something that's interesting. All of a sudden, boom, 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 something pops off in their mind and boom, off they go onto that tangent. The way things are, I think the biggest thing that's damaging the health of human learning is education. My primary concern is what I call stewarding the health of our children's learning, right? Like, there's nothing more important to our children's futures than how well they can learn when they get there. And therefore, there's nothing more important at any given time now than how well they're learning to get there, in the sense that their faith and confidence in learning is more important than anything we can teach them. And that led to work on what I call the learner interface, redesigning the relationship between human beings and information, not around a user interface, but around a learner interface. What would we want our relationship to information to be like if it was completely organized around supporting what we needed in the flow of our learning, that kind of thing. Until my own two kids came along and their struggles with reading dragged me right by the back of my neck, right into the core of reading. One, displaying and showing and revealing to me the complex artificial confusion that's in our code and what kind of a challenge, cognitive linguistic challenge is involved in processing it. And the other child, because of an auditory memory processing deficit, revealed to me not only the cognitive dyslexic components, but more importantly, the shame. What happened to children that are stuck against the edge of some kind of a learning challenge, who can't break free of it, don't have the meta-reflective abilities to say, hey, it's not me, it's the system, it's whatever. Instead, internalize it as something they're blaming themselves for, triggering shame, and triggering this downward spiral of shame, that really upset me. I realized I could learn anything if who or what I was learning from could meet me on the edge of my learning with what I needed to stay in it. And it seemed just nuts to me the world didn't work that way. The need to reorient how we think about the purpose of education is the start. So to me, the two starts, that's one of them. And the other one is we've got to change how we think about learning. Again, as I started to say earlier, this notion that learning is this utility for acquisition completely screws up everything about education and parenting. Right? Until we recognize learning's central dynamic in being human, until we recognize the difference between, and we didn't talk about this, natural and artificial learning, how radically different those challenges are, and how they precipitate different healthy and unhealthy reactions. Till we get that, we're really disconnected. We're not aligned. We're not aligning the adult learning with stewarding the children's learning yet.